The harvest feast at Ravensmere ran the length of the great hall, and at the foot of the lowest table sat a woman in grey, who did not lift her fork. 300 candles burned above the platters of glazed goose and roasted pheasant and bread, still steaming in its baskets, and Eleanor Wren folded her hands in her lap and let the food go cold in front of her while the room ate its fill. She was the new governess, 6 weeks in the house, and she had been seated where governesses were seated, below the salt, between an empty chair and a footman's station. No one watched her. That was the point of her. A woman the household had already decided not to see, present only as a service rendered, expected to take her plate when the family had finished and not before. So she sat very straight, and she did not eat, and she counted the minutes until she might rise without offense. At the head of the table, the master of Ravensmere watched her do it. Julian Ashby, the Earl of Ravensmere, had not meant to watch anyone that evening. He sat where he always sat, a man of 32 with a face the county called cold, and he was 3 sentences into a tedious account of the South Fields when his eye caught the grey gown at the far end and the untouched plate before it. He did not know why it held him. He told himself it was nothing, and yet his gaze returned to her twice more before the second course, and the second time he saw that her hands, folded so neatly, were pressed white at the knuckles, and that she was not idle but enduring, and that whatever sat behind her stillness was older than this room. You may already feel the shape of the thing. The Earl could not name. Stay close, because the reason she would not eat is the whole of this story, and he learned it far too late to spare her the cost. Eleanor had come to Ravensmere in the 3rd week of October, hired to teach the 2 children of the late Countess, a girl of 7 and a boy of 9, who had not spoken above a whisper since their mother went into the ground that spring. She had come with 1 trunk, and a letter of character, and a small folded miniature of a woman she did not show to anyone, the housekeeper, a spare and watchful person named Mrs. Tabbs. Pell had shown her to a room under the eaves, and told her the rules of the house in a flat voice, and the rules were many, and most of them concerned where a governess might not go, and what a governess might not say, and at what hour a governess was to be neither seen nor heard. Eleanor had listened and nodded and asked no questions, because she had learned long ago that questions cost more than silence, and silence was the only coin she had left. What the house did not know, because she had told no one, was that Eleanor had once sat above the salt herself. She had been the daughter of a Hampshire gentleman with a comfortable living and a library, and a mother who played the pianoforte until the candles guttered, and she had grown up expecting the ordinary kindnesses of her station, a season, a match, a household of her own. Then her father had died, owing money no one had known he owed, and the living had gone to a cousin, and the library had been sold by the page, and her mother had faded through one long winter and was buried beside him before the snow had melted. Eleanor had been 24 when she learned that a woman with no fortune and no father is not a person in the world's eyes, but a problem to be housed. The world had told her in the plain language of locked doors and averted faces that she was finished, that her best years were spent, that no one would ever again choose her for anything but her usefulness. She had believed it. She had folded that belief into herself, the way she folded the miniature into her shawl, and she carried it everywhere. And she did not weep over it, because weeping changed nothing, and the children needed her steady. The morning after the feast, the dowager came to inspect her. Lady Ravensmere, the Earl's mother, was a woman of 70, who had buried a husband and a daughter-in-law, and ruled what remained with the serene confidence of someone who had never once been wrong in a way that mattered to her. She found Eleanor in the schoolroom with the children, and looked at her the way one looks at furniture that has been moved, without permission. "You did not eat at the feast," the dowager observed, drawing on her gloves. "Mrs. Pell remarked on it. We do not keep servants who give themselves airs, Miss Wren. A governess who is too proud to take what is offered is a governess who imagines herself something she is not." She paused at the door. "You are a charity my son has taken on. Do try to remember it." Eleanor curtsied and said she was grateful, and the words did not cost her face anything, though they cost her something underneath it. When the dowager had gone, the little girl, whose name was Beatrice, crept close and put her cold hand into Eleanor's and said nothing, and the boy, whose name was Thomas, watched from the window with the careful blankness of a child who has learned that grief is a thing one hides. Eleanor knelt and gathered them both and told them in a low and even voice that they would read together that morning, and that she would not leave them, and that whatever the great people of the house decided about her, she had decided about them, and her decision was the one that would hold. It was the first costly thing the Earl did not see her do. It would not be the last. The Earl saw her 3 days later, in the long gallery, when she did not know he was there. He had come down the servants' stair to avoid his mother's morning callers, a small, undignified habit he permitted himself, and he stopped in the shadow of a pillar because Eleanor was kneeling on the cold floor before the boy, Thomas, who was weeping at last, weeping the way a child weeps when something has finally cracked the dam. The gallery ran the north length of the house, hung with portraits of Ravensmere earls, who had all worn the same composed and distant face, and the morning light came thin and gray through the tall windows and lay in long bars across the boards. Eleanor had no shawl. She had knelt straight down onto the cold floor in her gray gown without a thought for her own knees, and the boy had folded into her as though he had been waiting weeks for permission to fall. She did not hush him. She did not tell him to be brave, or to be quiet, or to be a little man. She held him, and she let him weep, and over his shaking shoulder she spoke to him about his mother, the dead countess, in the present tense of memory, naming small true things, the way she had laughed, the song she had liked, the particular way she had said his name. "She called you her lamb," Eleanor murmured into his hair. "She told me so. Mrs. Pell remembers it, and now you and I remember it, and that is 3 of us keeping it safe, and a thing kept by 3 people does not get lost." The boy's weeping changed at that, loosened, became something a child could come back from, and his small fist unclenched against her collar. Julian stood very still in the shadow of the pillar. He had not been able to do that for his own children. He had not known how. In the long months after the spring he had passed the nursery door and heard them and walked on, because to go in was to feel. And to feel was the one thing the carefully built cold of him could not survive. He had given them a governess instead of himself, and here was the governess giving them the one thing he had not been able to give, and he felt something move in his chest that he had spent a year keeping perfectly motionless. He did not announce himself. He could not have spoken if he had wished to. He left before she saw him. That night at dinner, however, he found himself watching the foot of the table again, and when his mother began some practiced observation about the difficulty of finding servants who knew their place, he set down his glass with a small, precise click, and said that Miss Wren's place was the schoolroom, and that he found her work there entirely satisfactory. And the table went briefly quiet at the unexpected length of his sentence, for the Earl was not a man who explained himself. Eleanor, at the foot of the table, kept her eyes on her untouched plate, and felt the blood rise in her face for reasons she refused to examine, and told herself he had meant nothing by it. That men of his rank spoke of servants the way they spoke of horses, as property well kept, and that to imagine anything else was a vanity she could not afford. What the Earl carried and what no one at Ravensmere spoke of had a name and a date. His wife, the Countess, had died in the spring of a fever that took her in 9 days, and in the last of those days she had asked for him, and he had been in London on business he had judged urgent, and was not, and he had arrived to find her already past speech, already turned toward the wall. And he had sat by her bed through a night that taught him exactly what his judgment was worth. He kept her miniature in the breast pocket of his coat. He did not look at it. He carried it the way a man carries a stone, in his shoe, by choice, to remember the cost of walking on. He had decided, in the long cold months after, that he would never again let his attention land on anything he could lose, and he had become the man the county called cold, because coldness was the only shape grief could take that did not break him. He did not know that the woman at the foot of his table carried a miniature too. He did not know that they were in the one way that mattered, the same. The trouble began, as trouble in such houses always began, with a visitor. The dowager had invited her late husband's grandniece to Ravensmere for the autumn, a young woman named Lady Sophia Carrow, polished in pale gold and entirely correct, with a dowry that would mend 3 roofs and a manner that had been trained since the cradle to fit precisely into the space a countess was meant to fill. The dowager's purpose was not hidden. Ravensmere wanted an heir's mother. The county wanted a wedding, and Lady Sophia wanted what she had been raised to want, which was exactly this house, and exactly this title, and a husband whose coldness she found neither here nor there. She arrived in a carriage with a crest on the door, and she was installed in the best of the guest rooms, the south room with the view of the park. And at dinner that night she was seated at the Earl's right hand, where the dead countess had sat, and she filled the place beautifully. Her gloved hand light on the stem of her glass, her conversation easy and correct, her laughter pitched exactly to the level the table preferred. The dowager watched her with the satisfaction of a woman watching a plan unfold precisely along the line she had drawn for it. And Eleanor, at the foot of the table where the governess was seated, below the salt, understood that the machinery of the house had begun to move toward a conclusion that had nothing to do with her and would crush her incidentally on its way. She kept her eyes on her plate. She had learned that a lowered gaze was a kind of armor, and she wore it through the soup and the fish and the long, bright talk of London and the season. And only once, when the Earl's voice answered some question of Lady Sophia's in its flat and level register, did her chest do the small, unpermitted thing, and she crushed it before it could finish. Lady Sophia was not cruel in the manner of a villain. She was cruel in the manner of a person who has never once had to wonder whether she would be fed. She noticed Eleanor on the second day, in the way one notices a draft, and she remarked to the dowager in a voice pitched to carry down the table, that it was charming how some households kept their poor relations on as governesses, and how one could always tell, could one not? A gentlewoman, fallen on hard times by the particular shabby gentility of her gloves. It was the second voicing of the thing the house had decided Eleanor was. The crowd at the table did the small, obedient thing crowds do, the half-smiles, the eyes that slid away, the laughter that was not quite laughter. And Eleanor, who had heard worse and survived it, felt her hand close hard around her fork under the cloth, and lifted her chin, and did not give them her face. The Earl at the head of the table had stopped eating, and the stillness that came over him was the stillness of a man who has just understood that a thing he values is about to be damaged, and does not yet know what he is permitted to do about it. He found reasons to be near the schoolroom after that. He told himself they were good reasons. A father ought to know how his children were taught. He came in the late afternoons when the light went gold across the floor, and he stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind him, and listened to Eleanor read, and the children who had begun to come unfrozen under her care did not stop their lessons when he appeared, which told him more about her than any letter of character could. One afternoon Beatrice was struggling with a passage, stumbling and ashamed, and Eleanor did not correct her sharply, but laid a finger under the word, and waited, with a patience that had no bottom to it, until the child found it herself, and looked up shining. Julian watched from the doorway, and felt the careful stillness in his chest move again. "You are gentle with them," he said when the children had been sent to wash for tea. And it was nearly an accusation because he did not know how to praise. "They have had enough that is not gentle," Eleanor answered, and then, remembering herself, lowered her eyes. "Forgive me, my lord. I forget my place." "You do not forget it," he said. "You simply do not perform it." And he turned and left before she could parse the strange shape of the compliment. And Eleanor stood in the gold light with her heart doing something it had no right to do, and told herself fiercely that an earl's idle kindness to a servant was the cheapest thing in the world, and she would be a fool to spend her last good cents on it. The proximity accumulated the way water accumulates behind a wall, invisibly, and then all at once. He began to find her in the library in the evenings, where she went after the children, slept to read by a single candle the books she had once owned by the shelfful. The library at Ravensmere ran 2 stories, the upper shelves reached by a narrow rolling stair, the leather spines going gold, and then dark as the candle moved, and it smelled of old paper and wood smoke and the cold that lived in stone houses after dark. The first time he had come for a volume and found her there, and she had risen to flee. The book pressed against her like a thing she had been caught stealing, and he had said, "Sit down," in the flat voice that gave no quarter. And she had sat, because one did not refuse an earl. And he had taken the chair opposite, and opened his own book, and they had read in a silence that was not empty. It became a habit, neither of them named. He did not speak much. He issued small commands that she slowly understood were not commands at all. "Eat something," he said one night, pushing a plate of bread and cold meat across the table to her without looking up, because Mrs. Pell had told him the governess often forgot her supper, and Eleanor had looked at the plate for a long moment, and her eyes had stung in a way she despised, because no one had told her to eat in a very long time. "Sit nearer the fire," he said another night. "You are cold." Another night still he had looked up from his book, and found her copying out a passage by the failing candle. Her eyes narrowed against the dark, and he had risen without a word, and lit 3 more candles from the branch on the mantel, and set them at her elbow, and said only, "You will ruin your sight," and sat down again. And the small blaze of light he had made for her was a thing she did not have words for, and did not try to find them. He was always, she realized, watching whether she was cold, whether she had eaten, whether she was well, and he disguised it as command. Because command was the only language a man like him had been given for care, and she heard the care inside the order even when she pretended not to, and her body knew the truth her mind would not sign. And her pulse moved when he entered a room before she had so much as turned her head. One night the talk came nearer than either of them intended. She had asked him, greatly daring, why he kept so few candles lit in his own study when the house had candles enough, and he had been quiet a long moment, and then said that bright rooms had stopped suiting him in the spring, and she had understood that he had told her something. A small, true thing offered across the table, the way she offered small, true things to the grieving children. And she had not pressed it, only nodded, and let the silence hold it gently. He had looked at her then, as though she had surprised him. Few people let his silences alone. Most rushed to fill them with comfort he did not want. She had simply let his stay. And in the letting, there was a kind of understanding that frightened them both, because it was the understanding of 2 people who had each buried someone and learned the same hard grammar of going on. If you have ever been seen, truly seen, after a long season of invisibility, you know the particular terror of it, the way the heart braces against the thing it most wants. Eleanor knew it. She braced. The break came at the November ball. Ravensmere held one every year. The great hall cleared, and the chandeliers let down and relit, and the county pouring in through the doors in silk and diamonds, and the dowager intended this one to settle the matter of Lady Sophia. Eleanor had not expected to attend. Governesses did not attend balls. Yet Beatrice had begged in her small recovered voice to see the dancing just for an hour, and the Earl had given permission, and so Eleanor stood at the edge of the gallery above the hall in her one good gown, the grey one, holding a child by each hand, looking down at a world she had once belonged to and would not enter again. Below, Lady Sophia moved through the figures of the dance in pale gold like a coin newly struck, and the dowager watched her with satisfaction. And the Earl danced with her because he had been given no graceful way not to. And Eleanor watched his face, and saw nothing in it, and told herself that nothing was the truth. The dowager found her on the gallery. She had climbed the stair on purpose, leaving the ball below, and she stood beside Eleanor at the balustrade, and looked down at her son and the gold-clad girl and said, without turning her head, that she hoped Miss Wren understood the kindness that had been done her in this house, and that she trusted Miss Wren was too sensible a creature to mistake an earl's courtesy for anything a woman of her station could presume upon. "I have seen it before," the dowager said, her voice low and almost gentle, which was worse. "A girl in service who lets herself imagine. It ends in dismissal without a character, and a long road, and no door that opens at the end of it. You are a governess and nothing more, Miss Wren, and the sooner you are certain of it, the kinder I will have been." It was the third voicing, and it was delivered in the witnessed hush of the gallery with the children standing close enough to hear, and it was meant to close the door for good. Eleanor took the children to bed. She did it with steady hands and an even voice, and she tucked the blanket under Beatrice's chin and let Thomas hold her sleeve until he slept, and only when both children breathed slow and deep did she go up the eaves stair to her own cold room and sit on the edge of the narrow bed and take the folded miniature from her shawl. It was her mother, painted the year before the money was lost, smiling the smile that had ended with the candles. Eleanor held it in both hands and did not weep, because weeping changed nothing, and she made the decision she had been refusing to make for a month. She would write to the agency in the morning. She would find another situation, far from Ravensmere, far from a gold light in a doorway and a plate of bread pushed across a table and a voice that said, "Sit nearer the fire," as though her warmth were a thing worth guarding. She would go before the wanting cost her the only thing she had left, which was her ability to endure. She had been seen, and being seen had nearly broken her, and she could not afford to break. She did not write the letter. She had no time, for in the gray of the next morning, the house woke to the news that the Dowager had taken matters into her own hands, and the matter she had taken was Eleanor. It had been arranged in the night, the way such things are arranged. Lady Sophia's family had a connection, a Mr. Harlan Crewe, a widower of 50, with a small estate in the fens and a need for a wife who would cost him nothing and ask for nothing, and the Dowager had offered him the governess, with a small sum to sweeten it, as one disposes of an awkwardness tidily and to general advantage. Eleanor was summoned to the morning room and told. The morning room was the Dowager's own, papered in faded yellow silk, a fire small in the grate, though the day was raw, and the Dowager sat with her tea untouched before her, and her hands folded and delivered the news as though reading a household account. She was told it was a great kindness, a marriage above what she could have hoped, a roof and a name, and an end to her uncertain state, Mr. Skaty. Crewe is not a young man, the Dowager allowed, but he is steady, and he keeps a respectable house, and he will not look too closely at a governess's history, which is more than you might have found elsewhere. You will thank me for this in a year, Miss Wren, when you are mistress of something and no longer a charity. In another woman's nursery, Mr. Crewe was already on the road. The Dowager had written to him a week ago. The thing was, in the language of the house, settled, and Eleanor stood in the morning room in her gray gown and understood that the machinery had reached her at last and meant to grind her into a shape that suited it, and that she had no father to forbid it, and no fortune to refuse it, and no standing in the world from which to say no. She thought of the children, of Thomas's arms locked around her neck, of the promise she had made and would now be made to break. She heard herself thank the Dowager. She heard her own voice from very far away, polite and even, a servant's voice, saying the words that servants say. Somewhere below the floor of her, in the place where her mother's miniature lived, something quietly broke, and she felt it go, the last small hope she had not known she still carried. And she kept her face entirely still while it went, because she had a great deal of practice now in losing things without letting it show. The Earl was not told until it was nearly done. He had ridden out before dawn to the far tenancies, as he often did, and he came back in the early dark to a house arranged around a decision made without him, and he learned of it from Mrs. Saya Pell, who told him with her flat face and a particular look in her eye, because Mrs. Pell had watched the governess kneel on cold floors with weeping children, and had her own opinion of charity, and had decided in her spare, watchful way whose side she was on. The Earl did not change his expression. He asked one question. He asked where Miss Wren was now, and when he was told, she was in the schoolroom making her farewells to the children because Mr. Berman Crewe's carriage was expected within the hour. The Earl of Ravensmere turned and walked through his own house with the particular unhurried speed of a man who has stopped, all at once being careful about what he might lose. He found her kneeling, as he had first truly seen her, with a child held against each side. Beatrice was crying without sound. Thomas had his face pressed into Eleanor's shoulder, and his thin arms locked around her neck, and was saying, over and over in his recovered whisper, that she had promised she would not leave them. And Eleanor was telling him the truth, which was the hardest gift she had, that she had not chosen to go, that grown people were not always permitted to keep their promises, and that he must be brave in a different way. Now, and her voice held. It held. It would not break in front of the children, even now. The Earl stood in the doorway. He had carried his wife's miniature in his breast pocket for a year, so that he would never again be a man who arrived too late. He had built his whole cold self around the vow, and he saw in the schoolroom in the gray afternoon that he had very nearly arrived too late again, and that this time there was still an hour, and that an hour was enough if he stopped being a coward inside it. "Miss Wren," he said, "send the children to Mrs. Pell. Then come with me." She rose. She did not understand, but one did not refuse an earl, and she sent the children with a kiss to each crown, and followed him down the stair, and her heart was doing the thing it had no right to do. And she crushed it, because hope at this hour was a cruelty she could not survive. He took her not to his study, but to the great hall, where she now saw the household had begun to gather for the spectacle of her departure. The dowager seated in state, Lady Sophia at her hand in pale gold, the upper servants ranged along the wall and through the far doors, just arriving, the heavy figure of Mr. Fye, Crewe shaking the rain from his coat. The arena was the same arena. The room that had seated her below the salt and decided not to see her was assembled to watch her carried off, and the Earl walked her into the center of it, and stopped, and turned to face his mother, and the hall went quiet the way a hall goes quiet when it senses, before it understands that the order of things is about to be broken. "There has been a mistake," the Earl said. His voice was level. It carried to every corner without rising. "Miss Wren is not leaving Ravensmere. No arrangement made for her without her consent has any force, and I withdraw it." The dowager rose, her face working, and began to speak of what was due to the family and what was owed to Lady Sophia and what the county would say. And the Earl let her reach the end of it, and then he crossed the floor to where Eleanor stood, 3 strides, the whole room turning with him, and he stopped before her and looked at her as he had never let himself look at anything he might lose. "Marry me, Eleanor. Not him. Me." The hall did not breathe. The dowager's hand had risen halfway to her throat and stopped there. Lady Sophia's pale gold composure had gone very still. The stillness of a woman recalculating a future she had thought already spent, and to her lasting credit, she said nothing cruel, because she had been raised to be correct, and there was no correct thing to say. Mr. Crewe stood in the doorway, with the reins still on his shoulders, and slowly understood that he had come a long way for nothing. And Eleanor Wren stood in the center of the arena that had decided not to see her, and was seen, wholly, by the one man in the room whose seeing reordered the world, and the thing she had crushed in her chest for a month came up through her like warmth through cold water, because her hand had already lifted of its own accord toward his. The way her body had always known the truth, her mind would not sign. The solicitor came the following week, summoned from the county town, and the settlements were drawn so that no one could undo them, the Earl seeing to the law of it with the same cold thoroughness he had once given to everything he did not love, turned now toward the one thing he did. The dowager was not destroyed. She was corrected. She kept her rooms, and her dignity, and her place at the table, and in time, watching the governess become the countess, and watching her son's face come slowly back to life, she said one stiff sentence of something that was nearly an apology. And Eleanor received it gently because she had never wanted the old woman's ruin, only her ceasing. Lady Sophia went home to her dowry and her correctness, and was married within the year to a viscount who suited her better. And the county, which had decided so many things about the woman in gray, decided one more, which was that the Earl of Ravensmere had always been a man of deep feeling under the cold, and that everyone had known it, which was not true, but was the kind of thing a county says when it has been proven wrong and wishes to have been right. They were married in the small church on the estate in the first week of December, with snow beginning outside the old gray stones, and only the household and the children present, because Eleanor had wanted no crowd, and the Earl had wanted whatever Eleanor wanted. Beatrice carried winter roses, cut from the one bush in the walled garden that flowered against the cold, and she had practiced walking slowly down the short aisle for 2 days, so that she would not run. Thomas stood up beside the Earl in a coat made small for him and did not whisper, but spoke his one given line in a clear voice that carried to the back of the little church, and Mrs. Pell, standing at the end of the household's row with her spare, watchful face, was seen to press a folded handkerchief once against her eyes, and then put it away as though it had never happened. Afterward, Thomas held Eleanor's hand all the way back across the white grounds to the house that was now, in plain and astonishing fact, her home, and his small mittened fingers did not let go, even when they reached the warm hall, as though he meant to make certain of her. That evening the snow came down in earnest, and the great hall where she had once sat below the salt was warm with firelight, and the long table was laid not for 300 but for 4, the Earl and the woman who was now his countess, and the 2 children who had unfrozen under her care. Eleanor sat at the foot of nothing now. She sat at his right hand, where the light reached her, and there was a plate before her, and this time she ate. And the small ordinary act of it, a woman eating freely at a table that had once decided she might not, was the whole of what the story had been promising from the first cold candle. The Earl watched her do it. He had taken his wife's miniature from his breast pocket that morning, and set it at last on the mantel where it belonged, among the living, no longer a stone he carried, to punish himself for walking, and beside it, Eleanor had set her mother's miniature, the smiling woman from the year before the money was lost. So that the 2 who had been gone kept company now above a warm hearth in a house that had room at last for everything that had been lost and everything that had been found. Later, when the children slept, Eleanor stood at the tall window of the room that was hers and watched the snow fill the dark grounds, and the Earl came and stood beside her, not touching, and they looked out together at the white and silent world. On the mantel behind them, the 2 small painted faces caught the firelight. Eleanor had come to Ravensmere with one trunk and a folded miniature, and the certain knowledge that she was finished. She had been wrong about the last of those. She watched the snow come down on the grounds that were now her own, and for the first time in a great many years she was not enduring. She was home. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If a moment of it stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me which one. And the snow will keep falling on Ravensmere for as long as someone remembers to look.